Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this special event in Humanities Centre's fall calendar. I'm Brian Clark, Director of the Humanities Centre. This event, which as you know, addresses the topic of authoritarian impulses in American history, has been organised in collaboration with three members of USD's Department of History. I will say a brief word about each of our guests and then retire to the back of the room and hand it over to you. Ryan Abrecht is chair of the Department of History. He earned his PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is a specialist in ancient Mediterranean history and culture, with a particular emphasis on the history of the Roman Empire. He has written on climate change, violence, and migration in late antiquity, and is a contributor to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome. Dr. Abrecht's most recent article, Neighbourhood Life in Imperial Rome and Han Chang'an, was published in the Cambridge University Press volume Place and Performance in Ancient Greece, Rome and China. It's very hard to overstate how important a partner to the Humanities Centre Dr. Abrecht has been these past years. He's produced some of the most memorable contributions to our discussion series. He's developed fantastic seminar classes for our students, and this semester has been centrally involved in the intellectual programming based around the performance of Chris Adler's oratorio, Aeneas in the Underworld. Thank you for all of that. Michael Gonzalez received his PhD from Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and specializes in Cold War history, modern US history, Chicano history, and historical methodology. Gonzalez has written widely, or Dr. Gonzalez has written widely on the history of Spanish and Mexican California, including in his book, This Small City Will Be a Mexican Paradise, exploring the origins of Mexican culture in Los Angeles. His most recent work has included the articles Flights of Fancy, Using the Historical Imagination to Understand the Franciscans of California, that was published in the Journal of Franciscan Studies, and The Eternal Flame, Stress, Epigenetics, and the California Indian in American Indian Quarterly. In summer 2015, Dr. Gonzalez was retained as an expert witness in the court case Reverend Ian Elliott versus Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. Reverend Elliott and others objected to the placement of a Christian cross on the county seal of Los Angeles. Reverend Elliott sued the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors to remove the cross. The law firm Caldwell Leslie and the ACLU asked Dr. Gonzalez to write a report showing why the cross was an inappropriate symbol for the county. Reverend Elliott and the ACLU won the case. I'm sure that's all down to you.
I like to think so, yes.
And finally, Kathryn Statler received her PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is a specialist in US foreign relations, the Vietnam War, France, and alliance politics. She is the author of the book Replacing France, The Origins of American Intervention in Vietnam, and co-editor of The Eisenhower Administration, The Third World, and the Globalization of the Cold War. Among her numerous articles is the recent piece, Death Grip Handshakes and Flattery Diplomacy, the Macron-Trump Connection and its greater implications for alliance politics, published in the collection The Liberal Order Strikes Back, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and the Future of International Politics. Her current book project, brilliantly titled Lafayette's Ghost, How Women and War Kept the Franco-American Alliance Alive, is a history of Franco-American cultural diplomacy from the American Revolution to the present. Dr. Statler, it should also be noted, oversees the Humanities Centre's collaborative research element, which includes, among a lot of other things, the Keck Undergraduate Humanities Research Fellows Program. Any students here should apply for one of those. So, with all of that said, please welcome Drs. Abrecht, Gonzalez, and Statler.
Thank you for being here. It's such a nice turnout. Someone pointed out to me that I dressed like the American flag, which was not planned. But I think I should get extra points. Okay, I'm part of this panel today because Roman history, can you hear me all right? Roman history has always loomed largely over American history. Rome has served both as a model and as a warning to us since the founding of our republic. America's founders, of course, looked to Rome for inspiration when they designed our form of government. In many ways, they wanted the United States to be like Rome, to emulate its success and its civic virtues. But they also worried about emulating the Roman model too closely. They saw the first half of Roman history, the Republic, as a great model, but the second half, the imperial period, as a time when Rome was corrupted by authoritarianism, and they feared following that trajectory. So start with happy things, right? First, there's the Republic as inspiration for America's founders. And one thing I have to note at the start of this talk is the nature of 18th century education. At the time, studying the Greco-Roman classics was considered absolutely foundational for any educated person. A student at a good grammar school would spend all morning and all afternoon learning to read Greek and Latin texts in their original languages. As a student mastered the classical languages, they would progress up to reading texts like Cicero's Letters or Plutarch's Lives. Shout out to Plutarch's Lives for my students in the class. College entrance exams in the 18th century would require you to translate passages from the ancient authors in Greek or Latin. So times have changed, folks. One benefit of this, though, this kind of rigorous classical education, was that 18th century men, and they were usually men, grew up with their heads crammed full of Greco-Roman literature and philosophy and history. That education has its limitations, but it also profoundly shaped the worldviews of a lot of 18th century thinkers and helped America's founders decide that the Roman Republic was the best model for the new government that they wished to build. And, there was much to admire about this ancient republic from the perspective of a revolutionary colonial. Consider the story of the Republic's founding. The Roman Republic began with an uprising against the corrupt king, whose family abused its power, trampled the rights of citizens, and instigated the tragic death of a universally admired noble woman. These tyrannical royals treated the state like a res privata, right? A private thing rather than a res publica, a public thing. And the idea that the state and its people shouldn't be treated like the private property of a monarch, but should instead be seen as a commonwealth held in possession by many, clearly appealed to the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who eventually, of course, became the authors of the Constitution. Even better, the Roman uprising against their king didn't happen as a spontaneous act of mob violence, but was instigated and led by a group of enlightened aristocrats who put the good of their city above family allegiance or their own self-interest. So the figure on the left here, pretty arresting bust, that's Lucius Junius Brutus, who was one of the leaders of the Roman Revolution, if you will, and one of the first consuls of the Roman Republic. His commitment to the new system was so absolute that, we're told, Brutus presided over the execution of his own 2 sons for treason after they were discovered to be plotting with the ousted king to bring him back into power. So, state above family. It's easy to understand how men like Jefferson and his peers could be inspired by figures like Brutus, a landholder who looked to build a society that was grounded in ideals of citizenship and certain shared rights, but which also, it should be noted, preserved a status quo that favored the best citizens. It's also worth noting that men like Brutus, like all Roman elites, were slaveholders. So there's perhaps an appeal there as well to men like Jefferson. As Brutus' story suggests, the Romans fought desperate battles against their former king, who tried to get himself back into power with the help of traitors, or loyalists if you want, and the backing of foreign troops. We have plenty of stories in authors like Livy about the heroic courage and patriotic sacrifices that these early Romans made, like the tale of Horatius, who defended the bridge into Rome against overwhelming odds, right, and saved the city. So too, of course, the American Revolution had its inspiring stories of outnumbered patriots fending off superior numbers in pursuit of freedom and in defense of their homes. Those American patriots who did the fighting didn't necessarily need fancy classical educations either to be inspired by stories of sacrifices in Rome's Republican past. They could get the message in other ways. And here, I'll call your attention to Valley Forge. You've all kind of heard this story, I'm sure. One of the bleakest moments of the revolution. Things are not going well. Washington is faced with his troops in a bleak winter, crisis of supply and of morale. One of the things Washington did at Valley Forge in that bleak winter was stage a play for his troops to entertain and to inspire them. The subject of that play was Cato the Younger, another figure from Roman history, this one later in the Republic history. This is a staunch Republican partisan who fought nobly against a different tyrant, Julius Caesar in this case, and chose to take his own life rather than compromise his commitment to republicanism by surrendering to Caesar. The play that Washington staged for his troops at Valley Forge was called Cato, a Tragedy by Joseph Addison, English playwright, very popular in the 18th century and in the colonies. In many ways, it was a fictionalized telling of Cato's life, but it very much chimed with Enlightenment ideals. It was all about liberty versus tyranny and reason and self-control over the emotions and things like this. So Washington staged this for his troops, realizing that they didn't need to learn Latin, and they wouldn't, to be inspired by Cato's story. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of give me liberty or give me death. When the war was over, the system that the founders designed was a classical republic, modeled in several ways on the Roman system that's described for us by ancient writers like Polybius. I won't go into details here, but suffice to say the designers of the US system rejected direct democracy, as the Romans had, we know this, in favor of a system that had democratic elements in which power would be shared among a group of qualified elites with some provision for new blood to enter their ranks. And here I'm thinking of the early American Republic. Both systems were designed, the Roman and the American, with checks and balances to ensure that no one man could acquire too much power or overpower the others. So, for example, I'm not going to get into all this, but in the Roman system, there were two chief executives called consuls, elected to annual terms. They were given broad powers. The term was imperium, but they also checked each other, and they themselves were checked by other branches of the government, for example, the Senate, which controlled finances. So you kind of get the idea here. It should sound familiar to anyone familiar with American government. Both of these republics were designed to insulate against populism because the designers of both systems believed that the masses were fickle and easily fooled. They worried that an unscrupulous, ambitious demagogue could ride a tide of popular support to the height of power and refuse to step down from that height. That's why there's so much fixation on civic virtue in the early American Republic and so much interest in Roman exemplars of civic virtue. Classicism provided in the early United States a model for norms that could hopefully insulate the American system against a slide into authoritarianism. So we get interest in men like Cincinnatus here, a figure from the very earliest days of Rome's Republic. Cincinnatus was a respected elder statesman who'd retired to his farm to live peacefully when a delegation from the Senate came to him in a panic seeking his leadership in a time of crisis. The story goes Rome was about to be invaded by some hostile neighbors. Cincinnatus agrees to come out of retirement and to serve as dictator, a special position with emergency powers to solve the crisis. In the story, of course, he drives off the enemy, saves the day, and then immediately turns around and goes right back to his plow, laying down extraordinary power to return to private life. Figures like this, possibly mythical figures like this, were seen as embodying the ideals of civic virtue. It's for this reason that Washington, right, who laid down his power after serving as general, then laid down his political power after serving as president 2 terms to become a private citizen. This is why Washington was called the American Cincinnatus, and of course why Cincinnati, Ohio is named after Washington by way of an ancient Roman figure. There's plenty of examples of this stuff, and I won't belabor the point. I realize time is short, but there's a lot of them. John Adams, lawyer, politician, obsessed with his reputation, was also obsessed with Cicero, a lawyer, politician, obsessed with his reputation. Cicero is also maybe our best primary source for Roman Republican values. His treatises like On Duties, On the Laws, On the Republic were all core texts for people at this time. And when Adams was president, he even more identified with Cicero, who was battered by the political forces of his own day. So these are Adams' words. President Adams said, Cicero was libeled, slandered, and insulted by all parties. He was persecuted by all factions, sometimes by combinations of all the factions together, and only for his most virtuous and glorious counsel and conduct. Injured, insulted, and provoked as I am, I blush not to imitate the Roman. The egos are amazing. Amazing, right? Even John's wife Abigail, who didn't read Greek or Latin, was thoroughly steeped in classical learning, as were many American women at the time. Both John and Abigail encouraged their son, John Quincy, the sixth president, to follow classical learning. And here's the connection to the Aeneid for the Humanities Center staff. John Quincy Adams produced an entire original translation of the Aeneid on his own in college. Abigail herself greatly admired Portia, the wife of Marcus Junius Brutus, the assassin of Caesar. Portia, we're told, was such a staunch supporter of her husband in his efforts to save the Republic and join a partner to his plans, that when she heard that Brutus had been killed, she allegedly swallowed hot coals and committed suicide rather than, again, live under a tyrant. Abigail, we're told, signed many of her letters to her husband John as Portia. So it's very in the air. You know what I mean? Very much. Now, sadder stuff. That's all well and good, right? Civic virtue, yes, yes, yes. But the other side of American classicism in the early Republic was a deep anxiety about the negative lessons of Roman history. America's founders knew the story of how the Republic collapsed in ancient Rome. They worried, too, that like Rome, the American experiment in shared government would end in a return to autocracy. That worry came out in a few different ways. One of the dangers America's founders recognized was the rise of political factionalism. As the Roman Republic gained territory and wealth, demographic and economic changes occurred that eventually led to a pressing need to reform the system as it had been originally designed. This is inevitable as time moves on. Any historian will tell you that. However, Roman politicians in their republic lost the ability to work together to enact necessary reforms. In the last century BC, two factions formed in the Roman Republic. Populares were, as the name suggests, populists who built political support among the marginalized masses by promising them things like land allotments, subsidized grain, better pay for military service, or more power over lawmaking and judicial cases. On the other side, we had optimates, opposed to many of these reforms, seeing them as giving too much power to uneducated people who couldn't guide the state with as much wisdom or foresight as the best men, which is, of course, where the optimal comes from. These factions weren't political parties as such, but over time, they became dug in to their positions in a way which would probably seem familiar to anyone who listens to politics for even half a second these days. Over time, people on either side of this divide came to see each other not as cives, right, citizens, but as hostes, enemies. And that becomes the political discourse of factionalism in the late Roman Republic. This sort of factionalism is, of course, one of the things Washington famously warned against in his famous farewell address: avoid political factions. For the Romans, political factionalism led to political violence in time. This began in the 130s BC with the murder of a populist politician named Tiberius Gracchus, who proposed a necessary land reform bill that would have alleviated a lot of Rome's growing problems with homelessness and mass unemployment. Gracchus was stymied by opposition from the Optimate faction in the Senate and drew on his supporters' votes to bend, or maybe break, if you see it this way, the rules of conduct to push his bill through. And after he did so, a group of senators and their entourages smashed the furniture in the debate chamber and used chair legs to beat him to death, along with many of his supporters. His younger brother Gaius, 10 years later, met a similar fate when he tried to enact even more reforms from the populist side of this divide. Students of American history, if you remember back to high school or a class you've taken here at USD, you might find yourselves thinking of a similar episode from a time of intense polarization in American politics. Here I'm thinking of the Brooks-Sumner caning, which happened in 1856 in Congress. Of course, the intractable issue at that time was the expansion of slavery into new territories as our republic was growing. Preston Brooks, a pro-slavery Southerner, got frustrated and used his walking stick to clobber Charles Sumner, an abolitionist, outspoken abolitionist senator. Sumner didn't die, thankfully, but Brooks' constituents loved this. They sent him walking sticks in the mail, right? And of course, within 5 years of this ugly episode, the American Civil War broke out. Political violence eventually led to civil war in both republics. We survived ours, and the Romans did not. Instead, the Roman Republic returned or fell apart and was replaced by autocracy. And here, of course, the key figure is Julius Caesar. Who was he? Caesar was a highly ambitious politician who felt thwarted by a system that didn't allow him to secure the prestige he felt that a man of his talent and lineage deserved. Caesar was a charismatic populist who recognized that the masses were more powerful than the best because there are more of them. So he spread money around and built a cult of personality around himself, famously by writing about himself in the third person as if these events were just happening and he wasn't causing them, right? Caesar was a brilliant general who did big things. He added new territory, greatly enriched the Roman state through success on the battlefield, and he was celebrated for it, even if he technically conducted his war past the time in which he had legal authority to do so. And Caesar was a ruthless politician who was willing to throw out the old rules and norms if he thought they never suited the times or his ambitions. He infamously accepted the title dictator for life from a cowed Senate after his victory over rivals in the civil wars. And of course, that made him a king, Rex, in all but name. He was assassinated, of course. Everyone knows this about Caesar, if they know anything about Caesar. But it didn't matter. His supporters, his wealth, and his power simply passed to his heir, who eventually became Rome's first emperor, Augustus. There's no going back for them. So worries about Caesarism loom large in early America. The problem is, if you design a system that resembles Rome, how do you avoid the fate of Rome? And the question became, was the rise of an American Caesar inevitable? I think we'd all agree historians don't like the word inevitable. It's a bad word for me. But I can tell you, within a couple generations, people were screaming that the American Caesar had arrived in the early republic. The key figure here is Andrew Jackson, 7th president. Jackson was very much not a product of the classical education of his day, but he achieved great fame and popular acclaim for his skills as a general. He was the hero of New Orleans who defeated the British in the War of 1812. He crushed an uprising of the Seminole Indians and later deported several tribes from their homelands on the infamous Trail of Tears. And there's even echoes of Caesar's activities in Gaul there, if you read the Gallic Wars. As a politician, Jackson was very much a populist, with a vision that the United States should be more democratic. He was a man of the people, whose humble background helped him gain traction against out-of-touch elites, we might say, in the Whig Party that opposed him. And in many ways, his coming to power was a political revolution, a turn in the page on the sort of revolutionary generation. And you see this in different ways. I just love this stuff. For me, this is like playing in a different playground. Jackson's inaugural reception at the White House, you may have heard, famously open to the public with food and drink freely available. It turned into something of a drunken riot with people kind of wandering around and breaking china. And Jackson, I think, had to escape from a window, and they had to lure people out into the lawn by moving the booze. It was kind of a disaster. And I'm sure classically minded elites who read their Plutarch were watching this, just shaking their heads, thinking of Plutarch's description of Julius Caesar's triumphal procession, where tables with food and drink enough to feed 20,000 citizens were lined up along the street, and it's a party for every man, right? Jackson leaned into this popular image when a New York dairy farmer sent him this enormous wheel of cheese wrapped in patriotic banners. He chose to leave it in the White House foyer, I think, for a long time, probably longer than cheese should be left. But the message is, this is for everyone. Come in and have a taste. Many of Jackson's opponents saw him as an autocrat who abused his veto power to override Congress, who degraded the dignity of the Senate, and of course it was rumored wished to become a king or to assume imperial powers. And, you know, maybe there was something to that. Some of his supporters kind of warmed to the idea of an American Caesar. In 1832, one of his constituent from Prospect Hill, New York, presented Jackson with an ancient medal of Caesar with his famous phrase on it, "I came, I saw, I conquered." And when bestowing this medal, the giver said, "Caesar was an oppressor who tried to raise a throne on the ruins of the Republic, but the hero of New Orleans strengthens the independence and liberty of our Republic. What Caesar did, Jackson has done better." I mean, not everybody loved it, though. Jackson was also the first president someone tried to assassinate. I don't know that there's a direct connection to Caesar here. The gunman, I think, was an unemployed house painter. But there's a lot of rhetoric flying around about tyranny, right? And if America could produce a new Caesar, why not a new Brutus? Right? Of course, there's a better example of that from 30 years later. Who's this handsome devil? You know? Everybody know? None other than John Wilkes Booth, of course. Booth's family was a celebrated troupe of stage actors. His father, I think I have him here, his father was Junius Brutus Booth, good Roman name, England's leading Shakespearean. John Wilkes appeared in a production of Julius Caesar as Mark Antony 1 year before he assassinated Lincoln. And of course, the words he shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," a Roman reference, Virginia's state motto. He was deep in this stuff. The password that the conspirators used when they orchestrated this assassination plan was Ides, as in Ides of March. So there's a lot more here, right? But I'll close now. I'll close by saying that as the 19th century progressed, American ideas about authoritarianism got kind of muddled, in my opinion. You could call your opponent an autocratic Caesar just because he was your own opponent. That's an easy tool to reach for, especially as the presidency became more and more powerful, as it did and continues to do. People still admired Washington for rejecting Caesarism, but America became more comfortable with imperialism and expansionism and kind of exalting figures like this. Apotheosis of Washington, my God. So classical references still inform the American Republic, but Americans increasingly warmed to the idea of authoritarianism, both abroad and at home. But I'll leave that to my colleagues to explore. So thanks.
Hi, everyone. Some of you are seeing a lot of me today, so apologies to my Vietnam War students and my History 300 students, but welcome. I just want to take the time to thank Brian and Lindy and Maggie, as always, for running such an amazing center. Just so grateful for them and for my colleagues, all my colleagues who are here, and for my students. So we're going to take a little turn, but you segued very nicely because you said the rise of presidential power, and of course that's what we're going to look at now. We're going to look at the rise of the imperial presidency, but even more important, as far as I'm concerned, is the congressional abdication of power. So yes, the president is grabbing for more power, but Congress is willingly handing it to the president. So I'm going to read just the very first part here, and then I'll get into the presentation. I think it makes some sense to look at Donald Trump's imperial presidency as the culmination rather than an aberration of the absolute rise of presidential power and absolute loss of congressional power, the zero-sum game that we talk about in class. And we can reach all the way back to Washington to look at this. I believe it or not. So yes, really Washington. What I'm really going to focus on is the increasingly authoritarian style presidency that emerges post-World War II and is always, always done in the name of U.S. national security. That's the key point there. As we're seeing right now, even with the deployment of National Guards into U.S. cities, it's always framed as national security. So for Trump, I might argue, such action is the logical conclusion of an imperial presidency that Congress has handed over bit by bit, certainly since 1964, and we'll get to that in a minute. As a result of Congress's abdication of power and the executive branch absorbing this power, the country has become less democratic and more authoritarian. That's the argument I'm making here today. So, U.S. presidency scholar, he's a dated scholar, granted. He wrote this in 1940. He wrote The President, Office, and Powers in 1940. But U.S. presidency scholar Edward Corwin wrote, the U.S. Constitution was an invitation to struggle for the privilege of directing American foreign policy. I might argue the struggle is dead today, or at least it looks like it's giving up the ghost a little bit. I'm not sure. But certainly this is a process that occurs. So in looking, I think it's important just to start with Article 1 of the Constitution, which, as we all know, is the legislative, not executive branch. And I'm not going to go through all these. I just want to read just the beginning of each one. The Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution regarding the legislative branch, well, the legislative branch declares war, raises and supports armies, provides and maintains a navy, makes rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, provides for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppresses insurrections and repels invasions, and provides for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, et cetera, et cetera. You might be forgiven for not immediately thinking of Congress and these powers that are laid out in the Constitution, because they are all but non-existent now for Congress. Okay, so in looking at, just quickly, the invitation to the struggle, this does go back to George Washington. George Washington, as he was trying to get John Jay's treaty, the Jay Treaty, 1795, that was going to solve some problems between the United States and Britain, he ran into trouble with the Senate. They were resisting him. There were many, of course, pro-French folks in the Senate at the time. And so you can look at his comments about the sort of intransigence of Congress and resisting this really good foreign policy deal. So already starting with Washington. We certainly see this with Thomas Jefferson in a couple cases. First of all, acquiring the Louisiana Purchase. There's nothing in the Constitution that says a president can just go ahead and purchase property from a foreign power. And Jefferson is a strict constitutionalist. He thought he was going to have to come up with a constitutional amendment. Luckily, members of Congress said, nah, go ahead. This is a good deal. It's not complete. There was an argument. But ultimately, he won out. There was no constitutional amendment, and we got the Louisiana Purchase. He also, this I don't have up here, but he also sends gunboats to Tripoli to fight the Barbary pirates without going to Congress and asking for a declaration of war. He sent them as sort of defense, but they are going to engage in actual conflict without a declaration of war. So very early on, we are seeing this invitation to struggle over foreign policy and U.S. military intervention. My colleague, Dr. Abrecht, already mentioned Andrew Jackson. So here I have this idea that Jackson is about to engage in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was hotly debated in Congress. Does the United States, bless you, have the authority to do this? Native American tribes are considered foreign nations at this point in 1830, not domestic dependent subjects, as they'll later come to be called. So again, there's a lot of congressional debate is, can we even do this? So there's already a struggle very early on in U.S. foreign policy and military interventions. It gets worse from there. I decided to go with a little bit of humor as we delve further into authoritarianism. But we get to what we might call the imperial presidency by the end of the 19th century. You could trace it back earlier. You could trace it back to James Monroe in 1823, who declares the Western Hemisphere is off limits to the Europeans. But I probably would start it with William McKinley, who had his own problems with Congress over when the timing of the Spanish-American War, when the war would actually start. But even more important, I might argue, is McKinley then decides to take a lot of territory, which was not in the declaration of war that Congress had agreed to. So here we have McKinley and the United States, sort of debating, here's your bill of fare, what should we take first? Cuba steak, Puerto Rico pig, Philippine floating islands, the Sandwich Islands. The United States is going to gobble all this up. In 1904, and repeatedly actually, we have the United States not only telling Europeans hands off with the Western Hemisphere, but now with the Roosevelt corollary. This is Theodore Roosevelt here with a giant gun pointing at what at the time was the Republic of Santo Domingo, so the Dominican Republic, Haiti today, but willing to use military force without congressional approval if European powers were encroaching on American space. So in terms of the last, I might argue, real invitation to struggle, the invitation to struggle between the president and Congress, I might put it at the end of World War I with the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations, that here congressional members, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, are not inclined to hand over really American unilateralism with this League of Nations. And so here you've got, this is clearly Wilson, a draft of the League of Nations. You've got the W.W. Woodrow Wilson. And then you've got Republican hostiles in Congress shooting arrows at him because they don't agree. They think this League of Nations is going to hand over too much American sovereignty. Here he's trying to convince members of Congress, hey, the League of Nations, it's not so bad. It's not so bad here. So maybe this is this last congressional, I might say, win. I'm not sure it was a win, but the Congress wins in that the United States is never able to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and thus join the League of Nations. So this is, I might date this as the last struggle, because here you're going to move on to World War II. So going back to this concern with presidential overreaching, if there's anything that's an overreach as far as people are concerned in first the 1930s with the New Deal, and then second with World War II, it's FDR. So the Constitution of the United States has been canceled by King Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as far as many people in the United States are concerned. The last official declaration of war, as many of you know, where FDR actually went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war, was December 8th, 1941. And from there, Congress is going to hand over power to the presidency with two War Powers Acts, late 1941, early 1942, completely reorganized the executive branch, independent government agencies, and government corporations for the war effort. The president is going to take complete control of the war effort. They're going to censor mail. They're going to acquire land for military purposes, often without compensating people who might have been on that land. You're going to see a massive, massive expansion of the executive branch. And along those lines, with this, this delegation of authority that's occurring, we actually get the Manhattan Project, which is hidden from Congress. So we have this incredibly secret, the building of nuclear weapons, or the attempt to build successful attempt to build nuclear weapons, that is completely hidden from Congress, that he gets away with under the War Powers Acts of 1941 and 42. We can debate whether that was a good thing or not. There were 120,000 people working on the Manhattan Project in 3 different areas. People knew what was going on anyway, not to mention the Soviet spies in the Manhattan Project. But still, this is hidden from Congress. Congress loses its authority. So this is a government, business, military, labor partnership that is cemented, but it's really cemented by the executive branch, not the legislative branch. Okay, so now things get even more grim. We move on to the Cold War, and what I would argue, this idea of perpetual war, that I would also argue we are still in. We are in a perpetual war that starts really at least by 1950, maybe 1948, 1949. So this sort of sums it all up. So the United States, and of course the United States, it's not Truman, but it's the President of the United States. He's laying for me, I can't stop. He's just biding his time, I have to keep up by the Soviets. This fear that drives American foreign policy and leads Congress to hand over control to the presidency, that is what is happening in the Cold War. We see it with the Truman Doctrine. He goes to Congress, asks for money for Greece and Turkey to try to stop communist subversion. He asks for the Marshall Plan to rebuild all of Western Europe, democratic Europe after World War II. We get NATO. We get our first standing military alliance in 1949. Last I checked, we're still building it. 1949. First standing military alliance in supposed peacetime since the Franco-American alliance of the American Revolution. And then we get something called NSC 68 that builds up the military industrial strength of the United States to fight a perpetual war against the Soviet Union. We get into a nuclear arms race, as we see here. Eisenhower is going to expand the Cold War. See, we get these presidential doctrines now all the time. Eisenhower is going to expand the war into the Middle East. We have covert operations, I'll come back to that at the very end, that are going on all over the world in the 1950s. So this massive military-industrial complex, bases abroad, is being driven by the executive branch, not Congress. It's being driven by the president. Okay, this brings me to my favorite subject, Vietnam, as many of you know. If I had to pick one document, one congressional act that sort of seals Congress's fate and why we are where we are today, it might be the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And apologies to Vietnam War students who have heard this. But I want to point out, when President Johnson claims that the United States has been attacked by the North Vietnamese in an unprovoked attack, which we know is not true, but he goes to Congress and he asks not for a declaration of war, but for a resolution. And I think it's really important to read this. He asks that the Congress approves and supports the determination of the president as commander-in-chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. To take all necessary measures is unlimited warfare. That is unlimited warfare. This, he kind of goes on, the national interest. Hey, we have to, under the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, we're going to defend South Vietnam. But then I want to come to the third part here. He says, well, actually, I should say, he says again, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, just in case we missed it before. Okay, so then this resolution shall expire when the president shall determine that the peace and security of the area is reasonably assured by international conditions created by the action of the UN, or it could be terminated by Congress if Congress chooses. But basically, it's unlimited again in terms of time. The president can do this as long as he sees fit. Remember that Article 1, Section 8 I showed you on legislative powers? It's gone by 64. That has disappeared. These are a couple of cartoons that, again, this is really grim, so I thought I'd go with cartoons. This one's actually not that funny. The other ascent into the unknown Vietnam. They're talking about actually the space race here, and I think it's the Gemini 4 that the United States has just successfully launched. So into outer space, and then the other ascent is into the unknown. It's into Vietnam. What does this mean? And even though the United States is the mightiest nation in history, so here's LBJ with all his nukes. Notice it's not Congress, it's the president, right? With all his nukes, and he's going to be taken out by these guerrillas, the Viet Cong in Vietnam. So all of this to represent the ascendancy of what I would call much more authoritarian or imperial presidency. Okay, Congress tries a tiny bit to take it back. We do have I didn't even put it up here because no one actually pays that much attention to it. The War Powers Act of 1973. President is supposed to consult with Congress within 48 hours of engaging in a military intervention and check back with Congress within 60 days. Yeah, the presidents sort of do that, sort of don't. But the Congress does attempt to take some power back after Vietnam, but is immediately challenged again in the 1980s. It's a very brief blip of Congress getting back into the invitation to struggle. The Reagan Doctrine says the U.S. will provide assistance to anyone, anywhere fighting communists, and then immediately decides to fund the Contras in Nicaragua against the leftist Sandinista government. Congress passes the Boland Amendment, a series of them actually, between 1982 and 86, saying you can't provide military assistance to the Contras. And from there, we get the Iran-Contra affair because the president just goes ahead and provides assistance to the Contras secretly going around Congress. So there are some congressional attempts, but it doesn't work very well. The first Gulf War and enlargement of NATO. These are my favorite cartoons. Okay, so Reagan, when being questioned about the Iran-Contra affair, I don't remember sending any, I wasn't giving money to the Contras or arms. It happened, but I didn't know. I might have known, but I don't remember. And then my favorite, I just remembered I knew, but the laws don't apply to me. Congress doesn't apply anymore. The first Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein builds this wonderful So when George W. Bush builds a wonderful coalition against Saddam Hussein, is what I meant to say there. Saddam Hussein thinks that George H.W. Bush, the father, he thinks that he's bluffing, and he thinks that he's bluffing because he doesn't think Congress is going to go along with this war. And the vote is close in Congress, but keep in mind, it's not a vote for a declaration of war, it's a declaration to authorize the use of force in the first Gulf War. And then the NATO one, this is more recent, and NATO expansion obviously starts in the 90s, but I couldn't resist because I love Putin I love his eyes in this, if you can see this. But the president is leading the expansion of NATO, not Congress. And you can see Sweden and Finland, right, are just settling into NATO as well. Okay. So where are we? 9/11 and perpetual war. The other most important document, I would say, is the status ever to kind of give power, Congress just hands over power to the presidency, is the Status of Armed Forces Agreement on September 18th, 2001. And that says that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any further acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. This is such a broad authorization of power that goes into effect September 18th, 2001. Just real quick, is this still in effect? This has never been revoked by Congress. So you can define anyone, anywhere as a terrorist. You might even do that at home. So this is this perpetual war, this idea of perpetual crisis that has left Congress, not even hamstring, Congress has chosen to hand this power over to the president. USA Patriot Act, this is for Dr. Nat Carney, who loves talking about the USA Patriot Act, because the acronym stands for the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. How can you resist it? It's the USA Patriot Act. If you don't go with it, you're not a patriot. So this leads to the war on terror and the surveillance state that the United States is currently under, run by the executive branch, not run by Congress. Now, technically, Congress actually did sunset the Patriot Act in 2020, officially. I don't know about all of you, but I still feel like we're in a bit of a surveillance state. I'm not sure. I feel like it's ended. War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. Second Gulf War, 2003 to 2011. Then back in dealing with ISIS. And this idea of perpetual war, the culmination of 1950 to today, if we are in a state of perpetual war, then the commander-in-chief rules unobstructed by Congress because it's been handed over, this authority has been handed over to the president. Just in case you're in doubt, just this week, now I started with the good news, ceasefire in the Israeli-Hamas war in Gaza. I think we absolutely have to give President Trump a lot of credit for that. But it's President Trump, right? It's not Congress. Authorization of CIA ops in Venezuela and the threat of ground strikes there, again, based on this idea of security. This affects U.S. security. National Guard ordered to Chicago, kind of on pause right now. Security issue. Pentagon denying news organizations access. Security. $20 billion bailout of Argentina if Javier Milei's party wins the midterm elections. Security, good ally, and also keep the Chinese out of Argentina. I want to point out in the middle of all, and by the way, today, if you notice, now meeting with Putin on trying to resolve Ukraine-Russia. He's very busy. So, and it's just the president, because what's Congress doing? Nothing. Nothing. The House of Representatives has been out of session since September 19th. September 19th. So, and again, earlier this year, I know Trump also talked about taking over Greenland, Canada, Panama, also framed as security, and also strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, also framed as security. Okay, last point. So today, I might say the invitation to struggle appears dead. Increasing congressional abdication of power since the Cold War, because of perpetual war, has resulted in an imperial presidency. This abdication created a welcoming environment for any president who wants to eliminate norms, reject rule of law, and rule by imperial decree. Executive orders are increasing. This Trump administration has already issued 210 in the first 8 months. I checked, more than any president ever. 210 in the first 8 months. Refusal to implement congressional legislation or congressionally appropriated money, or necessarily obey judicial rulings, military intervention abroad and at home with no congressional check. This is a logical conclusion, I might argue, to what we've witnessed. So if we don't reform, let me leave you on this cheery note. If our Republican form of government is to be saved, only an upsurge of direct democracy might be capable of doing so. One of my all-time favorite scholars, Chalmers Johnson, political scientist, said this in the early 2000s. Failing reform, nemesis, the goddess of retribution and vengeance, the punisher of pride and hubris, waits impatiently for her meeting with us. Thank you.
Okay, my friends, thank you for being here. I too want to congratulate my colleagues for giving such great talks, and welcome old friends and new friends, and also thank Dr. Brian Clack, and Maggie for their tremendous help. Maggie's always rides to my rescue when it comes to technological issues. She's a great benefit. So I thank you for being here. This is my talk. This is Trump and his empire, and this is an actual press mock-up made by the White House press office on February the 25th of this year, where, for reasons I don't understand, Trump condemned and criticized the congestion pricing in New York City. And somehow the White House press office considered this pronouncement a victory. And so the White House press office came up with this mock magazine cover, and it shows President Trump in all his glory. There's Manhattan behind him, and it says at the bottom, "Long live the king." So what I'm going to argue today are just two things. First thing, I will argue that President Trump is the culmination and the perpetuation of certain tendencies in American democracy, which observers at home and abroad have long noticed about the American approach to democracy. The second thing I will argue, there's something peculiar, at least the people I cite, about American capitalism, and there's an inherent weakness in American capitalism that gives power and prestige to people like Donald Trump. So we continue. Well, let's define authoritarianism American style. And of course, I refer to Alexander Hamilton, Federalist No. 1 from 1791. And this speaks to what my good friend and colleague, Dr. Abrecht, was talking about. The Founding Fathers are greatly concerned about the power of the mob in the hands of a clever demagogue. And here, Alexander Hamilton writes in Federalist No. 1 that those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying obsequious court, obsequious meaning paying homage, paying obsequious court to the people, commencing as demagogues and ending as tyrants. You play to the crowd, you play to the mob, and when the mob celebrates you as the leader, then you become a tyrant, and then you will then have the authority to run government, override all other instruments of government to maintain your power. Now, I don't want to many of us, including myself, sometimes will blame Republicans for having this tendency to celebrate power. And I don't want to criticize Republicans too much, but just to reinforce this interpretation, some of us might be familiar with the Politico If you're familiar with the Political controversy, Political is a online news website, and it broke a story about the young Republican organization all across the United States, especially organizations in Vermont, Texas, and I think Virginia, where Political was able to somehow, either through a leak or break into these transmissions, these texts. And so I was prowling the dark corners of the internet. And I found this cartoon in one of the darker corners. And this cartoon mocks this Republican claim that they're unfairly criticized for having authoritarian tendencies. So the left panel of their cartoon says, stop calling everyone you disagree with a Nazi. Calling people Nazis is hateful and divisive. Oh, I guess everyone is a Nazi now, so on and so forth. Then the other panel shows the actual texts that were uncovered by Politico. I love Hitler. Room 1488. 1488 is a white supremacist code word. 14 is the white supremacist oath to maintain the integrity and purity of the white race, and it's 14 words long. 88 is the 8th letter in the alphabet, and the 8th letter in the alphabet is H, and an HH means Heil Hitler. And then you keep on going, expecting the Jews to be honest, and you have a smiley face. Watermelon people, with reference to African Americans. Stay in the closet. Well, this is a derogatory term for gays. Can we say, I'm sorry for the resolution. Can we wait for the showers? That way, we want to make sure everybody fits into the showers. There's a reference to the death camps at Buchenwald and Auschwitz. So the popular interpretation is these authoritarian tendencies emanate from the Republican Party. And things like this sort of reinforce that perception. And this too, this is from The Economist, the most recent issue of The Economist. And this is a poll from October the 8th. This is from the October 8th issue of The Economist. And the poll was conducted between September 30th and October 2nd. And various individuals, Republican, Democrat, Independent, were asked, would you favor these particular policies? Sending troops to cities governed by his opponents, something my friend and colleague Dr. Statler talked about. 75% of Republicans support this dispatch of troops to American cities, whereas very few Democrats and maybe a greater number, but still significantly less than 75% Independents support the dispatch of troops to American cities. And we keep on going down the line for each of these measures to investigate. The Department of Justice investigating Trump's opponents, directing federal funding away from states or cities governed by his opponents. And in each of these categories, Republicans are vastly overrepresented, whereas Democrats and Independents are distinctly in the minority. So the impression is that these are Republicans who favor authoritarianism. However true this is, I argue that perhaps, but there are other things we should be mindful of as a nation and as citizens of the United States. So let's broaden this. So now, who favors Donald Trump? This is from earlier this year. Now, I don't know, I couldn't find a reliable poll to talk about current attitudes. So this is already 10 months old, so bear that in mind. Talk about who favors Donald Trump. 53% of men have a positive view of Donald Trump, while 35% of women do. Trump is viewed best by white evangelical Christians, 69%, white men without college degrees, 65%, and those who live in rural areas, 57%. And we can keep on going, how women, especially women, educated women, are least likely to like or admire President Trump. So we can see now it's not only maybe Republican, but you can see how the demographic favoring President Trump might be a little bit broader than we may imagine. Now, when I talk about the peculiar tendencies of American capitalism, which may enhance his appeal, we go to this. Masculine self-perception by party. This is from the New York Times. This is from March the 5th, 2025. I could not find a more recent poll, so take that into account. This is, 7 months ago. Republican men are more likely to rate themselves as highly masculine. And so 53% of Republican men or who lean Republican see themselves as highly masculine. Democrats, or lean Democrat, are 29%. Now, is this significant here? How you measure masculinity. Now, I want to expand the base some more. This study is from June 26, 2025, and it shows how the Trump coalition is broader than perhaps you might expect. Among Hispanic voters, Trump battled to a near parity in 2024. 51% for Harris, 48% for President Trump. For African Americans, he won 15% of black voters, 8% above from the year 2020. And here, just for the heck of it, some of you may already know from having taken my classes, I'm from East Los Angeles, so I went back to the capital, the new Aztec Empire in Los Angeles, which is where I'm from. And this black area is my old neighborhood, and this is the voting precinct where I live. And you can see how even in this area, which is 95% Mexican origin, Mexican immigrant, or Mexican American, working class, union, or menial labor, you can see how in 2020, President Trump, in my voting precinct, received 12% of the vote. In 2024, 24% of the vote. And according to the math by the New York Times, this is a 25% increase over 2020. And the red signifies how many votes. The deeper the red, the more votes President Trump received in an area that is largely Mexican in origin. So these authoritarian tendencies are not only confined to Republicans, but there seems to be something going on here. Something else is happening that perhaps we should be mindful of. So let's talk about the history. And that's kind of, I'll just be very quick here. My good friend and colleague, Dr. Statler, talked about this long tendency of authoritarian tendencies in Congress. And I'll just give you 3 examples. Alien Sedition Act 1788. This is from the National Archives. No need to really worry about what the text says. But basically, and they're repealed in 1802, that the Alien Sedition Acts of 1788 basically empower the president to deport aliens, people he didn't like. We also have here part of this Alien Sedition Acts is that you could basically arrest anybody who prints, utters, or publishes any false, scandalous, and malicious writing about the government. So the alien, even though they're repealed, even from the earliest days of the Republic, there's already this authoritarian tendency circulating in the nation where the president is empowered to act as he wishes to, as Dr. Statler says, promote national interest. But still, the point remains, why? Second man, this is me as an historian, I'm shocked no one talks about this man even more. He's largely forgotten. In his day, Franklin Roosevelt said he was the most dangerous man in America, other than Douglas MacArthur. This is Huey Long, senator from Louisiana. Huey Long began a movement called Share Our Wealth movement. The motto of the movement was, every man a king, but no one wears a crown. He was a senator from Louisiana, and this is a photo from his radio address from February 23rd of 1934. And this is he's inside his the radio booth after he gave his speech. But this was a movement begun by the senator where he wanted to nationalize oil industry, seize banks, make sure every American had access to a car, a house, free education. Doesn't sound so bad, but the reason, the rationale he was going to use to accomplish these ends was authoritarian. He wanted to run as a third-party candidate for the 1936 presidential election. He would split the Democratic vote. The Republicans would win the election, and he was confident that the Republicans would be so incompetent that there'd be no measure the Republicans can pass to save the nation from the Great Depression. For the 1940 election, he felt he would win the Democratic nomination, win, because the Republican incumbent would be incompetent and unpopular, then he wanted to suspend the Constitution for 16 years so that he could implement his measures. The only reason why he failed, because a year after this photograph was taken, he was assassinated by one of his political opponents in Baton Rouge. So we'll never know how far he would have gotten with his plan. And of course here, we have George W. Bush. We have the unitary executive model, something that, that President Trump is oftentimes invoking. The unitary executive model is this conservative interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, which maintains that the president has a right to apply the laws as he sees fit. Forget what Congress says. He has the right, as the unitary executive, to interpret the law and apply the law in ways he thinks appropriate. And ironically, I realized that during President Trump's first term, George W. Bush was oftentimes hailed as a worthy model of the presidency, a worthy Republican model at that, of how a president should conduct himself. But if anyone laid the intellectual groundwork for President Trump's predisposition to issue executive orders, it was this man, George W. Bush. Now, let's talk about why. I've given you all these examples, but why? We go here. John Adams. John Adams, in his own way, was very fearful of the mob. He feared that a democracy was always doomed to fail because there was no leader could control the avarice, the greed, and the selfishness of the people. And he writes here, when clear prospects are open before vanity, pride, avarice, ambition, for the easy gratification of these impulses, it is hard for the most considerate philosophers and the most conscientious moralists to resist the temptation. Individuals can overcome these temptations, but a people, bodies of men, never. So in 1814, that's Gilbert Stuart. This is the Gilbert Stuart portrait of John Adams. He warned there's nothing in American democracy, as was practiced, to stop the mob, the tyranny of the majority, from gaining influence. This takes us to Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat who came to the United States in the 1830s to view the American penal system. And when he returned home to France, he wrote Democracy in America, and he described soft despotism. He said Americans are torn by two impulses. One, he talks about two conflicting passions. They want to be led, and they wish to remain free. He said that despite our need to be free, practice democracy, we have this innate need to have a leader, perhaps a strong leader. So then, de Tocqueville argues, as they cannot destroy either the one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole, tutelary, and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralized and that of popular sovereignty. So in his eyes, Americans seduce themselves thinking, well, we're practicing democracy. But this democracy needs a leader, a strong leader, to lead the nation. So this gets back to John Adams' idea. This is how a government or a democracy commits suicide. You willingly choose a strong leader because you want to be led. Now, Andrew Jackson, I have to pay tribute to one of my professors in graduate school, Michael Rogan, and this is where capitalism comes into play. Michael Rogan was a great scholar, and I took his class when I was in graduate school, and he wrote this book, Andrew Jackson and the Subjugation of the American Indian. Dr. Rogan made this argument. One of the peculiarities about American capitalism, it's very gender-based in the eyes of Dr. Rogan. Men are conditioned to be independent, strong, and create their families. And that's how men take their measure, by being strong, by being the breadwinner. But what happens? What happens if a man is unable to find success, unable to create his own household? Therefore, as Dr. Rogan says, that is why Andrew Jackson became celebrated and favored because in the economic turbulence of the early part of the 19th century, you have a cataclysmic depression. You have immigration coming into the United States, so the nation's undergoing all these changes. And the old ways of success, at least in the eyes of Americans in the early 19th century, were no longer providing prosperity. So therefore, as Dr. Rogan argued, Jacksonians created specific institutions, party, executive, the state, to replace the family. If the father could not form a family, was not able to have the resources to create a family, he looks to a strong leader. And living through the strong leader allows the man to feel masculine. If he couldn't exercise strength, at least he'll look to a strong leader to experience that strength. So finally, this brings me to the end here, so I'll make sure we have time to talk. Francis Fukuyama wrote a short essay called The End, and maybe some of you have read this essay. Okay. Francis Fukuyama, in the summer of 1989, talks about the end of history. In this very short, brief essay, he argues that from the French Revolution up through 1989, the world had engaged in all these epic struggles. Authoritarianism, fascism, totalitarianism, militarism, communism, and capitalism. And since the French Revolution, there had been various wars and struggles to see which side was going to win, which system was going to emerge triumphant. Francis Fukuyama says that capitalism, especially the American version of capitalism, emerges triumphant. He calls it liberal capitalism, where the individual and the individual's chance to succeed becomes the ideal. But Francis Fukuyama warned, right in the last paragraph of his essay, he warns that what if that then becomes the measure of status, the measure of success, a world devoted to capitalism? He says it's going to be a very boring existence. Notice how Francis Fukuyama sort of genders the way, that is, the way he sees America's strength and the struggle against all these other ideologies as a masculine enterprise. He says they struggle for recognition. The struggle for recognition, the struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. He says, perhaps this very prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started once again. So, Francis Fukuyama is basically arguing that in a world that has been made homogenized by capitalism, especially consumerism, what is there to live for? Maybe that is why people like Donald Trump become popular, because we can, well, at least some of us, who might feel marginalized, maybe have a hard time achieving success. We may not be able to feel manly, but perhaps we can live through our leader, who will be a man for us. And for those of you who were here for my presentation back in March, where I talked about the president's fascination with the frontier, going to the moon, celebrating the pioneers moving from east to west across the American continent, having the image of Andrew Jackson having pride of place in the Oval Office. All these are echoes to the strength and desire of a strong leader leading his people, and it is a sense of strength that attracts his admirers. This brings me to the end. What do we do? This builds what my good friend Dr. Statler talked about. What do? We talk about a different form of authoritarianism. We talk about the military-industrial complex. And on January 17th, 1961, the night before he takes the oath of office, the night before JFK takes the oath of office, Dwight Eisenhower issued a warning about the current state of American politics as of 1961. He basically says, in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Then he continues, how do we stop this? what do we have to do as citizens to stop this? To echo Chalmers Johnson, we must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted, only an alert, and this is for us, your instructors, and you, the students, only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, populace, can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with their peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. So as Chalmers Johnson talks about direct democracy, Dwight Eisenhower is talking about having a populace, the citizens, you, us, being aware about the nature of the country and the direction it's going. And so perhaps it's the only antidote to authoritarianism and fighting off its tendencies is to just keep on doing your homework and reading. That's all I can say. Anyway, my friends, thank you very much. And I thank you for your time.